It's real. She's a real cat, guys. I promise. And joining us today for this video, or at least part of it, this is Luna, and she is Sonia's baby kitten. I love her. Hello, and welcome to the Baba Yaga Project. This is a new part of the project that we're hoping you guys will be excited about. It's a new series that we're calling The Historian's Craft, and we want it to function kind of like a condensed university degree. Basically, we went to grad school and read for Kerr and Foucault and some other stressed out Frenchmen so that you don't have to. We want to break down how historians think when looking at historical sources and how we place contemporary ideas and events into historical context. Our goal is that by the end of this series, our viewers will have a better understanding of how we, as historians, do this, and how anyone experiencing the events of the world can be more historically literate. For a bit of background, if you're joining us for the first time, the Baba Yaga Project is a digital humanities project started by myself, Margot Mathieu, and my partner in all things weird and historical, Sonia Pereira. Sonia is a PhD candidate, and I'm a public historian with a master's degree. So where do we start when we want to know more about history? What even is history? How do we know things happened in the past? How do we know anything? Do I have answers to any of these questions? Maybe. Let's find out. So the history of history is a long and sometimes fraught tale. A few different philosophical theories go into our understanding of the discipline and definitely into all of our confusion about it. For our purposes here, an argument could be made that history began in the classical world, or ancient Greece. For the most part, the texts we have coming out of this period are epic poems and theater, but we do have some histories. But are these histories as we would classify it now? What's the difference and what's going on? So the histories we're talking about here have a very narrow categorization and a very specific set of parameters for understanding what they are. They're accounts of what happened without embellishment or editing, or construction on the part of the author. Or at least this is what many authors claimed they were. They often claimed the knowledge as a direct account of what they saw happen with their own eyes. This is a specific convention of Thucydides, who wrote about events of the times that he lived through. Herodotus, who is often credited as the first historian, who wrote about the times long past and the roles of Greek goddesses and gods and goddesses. These histories occupied an interesting place culturally during this time. They are mentioned specifically in Aristotle's Poetics as a sort of antithesis to the poetic work, which is something that can say what happened but not the truth of an event. For the truth to be known, a work must have a plot, a resolution, a clear causal relationship between events, and a history can never have that. So how did we get to history as we know it now? A purportedly true explanation of events in the past. If you listen to the podcast, you know we're about to call out some Victorians. So much of our contemporary culture and understanding has its roots in the 19th century, particularly the Victorians and revolutionaries of Europe and the progressives of North America. The work of Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle, remained important in moving forward toward the contemporary world and was combined with theology in the Middle Ages, both in the Islamic world and in the Latin Christian Europe. Historical accounts of events continued along through the Middle Ages and early modern period, mostly as supposed eyewitness accounts, transcriptions by monks, or a simple cataloging of events called an annal. But the explanation of events was left to theological text and learned interpreters. This is until the 19th century, when the scientific method really gets off the ground and epistemology is forever changed. Epistemology, to clarify, is the study of knowledge. Essentially, how do we know something? So it's the late 1700s, early 1800s, and everyone is really fired up about all sorts of new inventions and scientific discoveries. A theory of knowledge is coming out that we can prove things with solid physical evidence. The world is rocked. Universities are shaken to their core, and nearly all academic disciplines are revolutionized. We can say we know things because we can prove that they happened or exist or whatever with physical evidence. This seems obvious now, but it was really revolutionary for the time. And this actually really shook people up. There were theological debates that sprung up because of this. The Second Great Awakening that has led to modern evangelicalism has its roots here. This is when history as a discipline becomes just that, a discipline. There are systems and rules developed for how we create a causal link for what evidence we trust and how we trust it. There's a system for what I'm doing now, which is essentially argumentation. Here's what I know, here's the evidence for how I know it. This becomes the study of history, the historical discipline. So the conventional understanding of history we use now came about in this period. Essentially, it's things we know happened in the past because there are written documentary data to back up these claims. These documents are known as primary sources, a document created during the time you're studying that speaks to the question you're asking. But this is where things get a little tricky and, in a way, come full circle back to the claims made in ancient Greece and medieval monasteries. Isn't asking the question, looking at particular data, editorializing by the historian? I'll explain what I mean. When we go through our days, a million little things happen. Each step is an event. And this is part of how everyone has lived their lives since the beginning of time. But when someone asks what we did that day, we filter it out. We assign meaning to certain actions and no meaning to others. But how do we do that, and who gets to choose? And when it's the history of a nation, a people, a war, who gets to choose what steps are important enough to include? And how do we really know that that particular line of events really have a causal relationship? So this is a bit of a crisis in the historical field, and a few others as well. The way we tell stories and assign meaning to events, the way we remember things, is different from how they actually happen. We can experience something as random, but we might tell the story of that event as the cause of something else. But while it's happening, we don't know it's the beginning of anything. So when we ask questions like we do on the podcast, like where did our marriage rituals come from? Why do we wear white dresses? When did people become teenagers? The framing of the question implies a beginning that can't really have acted as a beginning at the time. The historical question creates the history. Language creates the narrative, and narrative needs plot. And we need causal relationships. Does that mean that history is all made up? Not at all, because things do have causal relationships, and we do leave evidence behind. What we know now more than ever is that people create larger systems of society that we as individuals exist inside. And it is often the forces of these systems that are the causal link between events, or vice versa. So teenagers started to become an identity at the tail end of the 19th century when the effects of industrialization were causing a breakdown in rural community support systems that young people had previously been dependent on. But what caused the industrialization? A whole bunch of actions in manufacturing and banking and enterprise, much of which confused me to no end. So it's sort of a both and situation. And this is where studying history can get really fun, because the 20th century threw everyone for a loop. Suddenly, there is so much more media of all different types. Now, a film or recording is a primary source as well, and perhaps most importantly, we're realizing how unreliable written sources can be. We're learning how to take these sources apart and find out how and why people were writing them. And this for me is the best part, because we, and by we I mean people like me, white Euro-Westerners educated in a European system, are learning again just how complex the systems of oral history are. And we're able to use oral history as sources as well. Our understanding of our past is expanding 1,000-fold. We're not just hearing the perspectives of one white man, but hundreds of people who were part of a historical event. Later in this series, we're going to talk about how to read primary sources and do a deep dive into the concept of historical agency, which are really vital to understanding and contextualizing events. But for now, I really just want to marvel at how much information we have access to and how much history there still is to do. So how do we know a historian is right? This is an amazing question because one of the great things about history is that the answer is so often, why not both? People are not simple, and neither are the systems we develop or our understandings of the world, or why we do things. A historian's job is to ask a specific historical question and use the sources available to answer that question. Then, using that evidence, we build an argument for why we think certain things happened the way they did. If the evidence and that argument stand up, then other historians will be like, yeah, that totally happened. But someone else might come along and say, well, actually, X, Y, Z. And my favorite thing is when we can look at arguments and the consensus is, why not both? Historical study isn't a zero-sum game. Now, don't misunderstand me, there is bad history out there. Historical claims that just don't have evidence to back them up. The American Civil War was not about slavery is an example that comes to mind. There is just no historical evidence to back up this claim. I will not be fighting with people in my comments about it. It just didn't happen. But a question like, was the Industrial Revolution supply-driven or demand-driven? Did we find a ton of coal and dream up industries to use it all? Or did we need to develop a coal-dependent industry to feed consumer demand for products? I mean, it's kind of both and. Or at least some parts are one and some parts are another. In conclusion, we are so excited to start this video journey with you. Our video content will focus more on these kinds of historical questions. How do we read sources? What is narrative theory? How did a particular political idea come to be? Or how did we do things before a certain invention came into our lives? We really hope you'll subscribe and maybe even check out the podcast, where we do a more long-form conversational exploration of historical life practices and rituals. But thank you so much, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Mommy, the ocean.